Today I'm in Greenock, and on our travels I am going to tell you about the Radical War of 1820, sometimes forgotten, not often discussed, but something that has really paved the way for modern society. Welcome to Exploring Scotland's History. This memorial in Greenock has a rather tragic and fatal backstory. The memorial remembers the Radical War of 1820 and all those who died in it, also known as the Scottish insurrection. An economic downturn around this time was fueling a lot of unrest, but what was having a much deeper impact with the unrest was the Industrial Revolution. It was damaging how artisans made their living. For instance, between 1800 and 1880, weavers' wages dropped. Often weavers were paid per piece or per amount of work that they produced, and it was really taking a toll on their earnings of a week. Despite petitions by magistrates being passed to improve wages and increase them, employers simply refused, and in 1812 there was a 9-week strike. Spies and informers were quickly parked amongst those that were having issues, and it wasn't just the weavers. Wrights, shoemakers and smiths, along with the weavers, were those who would have had conspirators and spies planted amongst them. The Depression post-Napoleonic War wasn't really helping the situation. The Peterloo massacre had happened in August 1819. Cavalry were sent in to protesters and people were killed, and really it was the well-heeled, the well-to-do getting very nervous that their piece of the pie might be under risk. To be fair, they didn't seem that bothered by anyone else's piece of the pie. In total, that day of protest cost 15 people their lives. September the 11th saw a memorial rally in Paisley for those that had fallen at Peterloo. 5,000 attended, but the cavalry were sent in again to try and deal with the radicals. That led to a full week of rioting. Things were starting to go down. By the 13th of December, the radical laird was lifted in Dundee for trying to amass people together and have rallies. He luckily escaped, but was forced to flee to France, a country that he had fought for during the French Revolution. On the back of the French Revolution and the turmoil in Ireland, the landed gentry were starting to feel very, very nervous. And people were protesting not just because of loss of wages, but it's important to point out only 1 in 4 people in Scotland at that stage had a vote, and they were the well-heeled nervous folk. A radical committee had been formed, and although due to spies and informants, many would be arrested at various points during the meetings, but things were starting to move forward for the radicals. A rising was imminent, and plans to form a provisional government were set in place. The adjoining proclamation was made and printed, and by Sunday the 2nd of April the distribution started. By Monday 3rd of April, most of Glasgow had received the sheets about the proclamation and the government, and there was a general downing of tools. People were prepared to work for next to nothing. It is estimated that 60,000 people, and a lot of them weavers, downed tools that Monday morning. But they didn't hang about and just sit around and wait for things to happen. They might have been manufacturing turnpikes and they all drop of gunpowder instead. The first week of April, the Hussars were forced to guard the Carron Ironworks, as many of the radicals had great plans of getting in there and getting stuff for their armoury. Radicals were captured from Strathaven, Bonnymuir and East Kilbride, and 10 spent the night of the 7th of April in prison in Hamilton. 5 prisoners were also en route by cart to Greenock jail. The cart was manned by the Port Glasgow volunteers, and they did have a wee bit of hassle getting through Port Glasgow, but as they came further down the road into Greenock, I think the word was out of what was about to happen and people were starting to gather. It's fair to say that Greenock were slightly more hostile about the situation. They were stoned mercilessly as they tried to get the cart into town. They were fired at from closes and from high places. The powers that be fired shots in the air, didn't disperse the crowd. Turned out firing shots into the crowd didn't disperse the crowd either. The magistrate demanded that the crowd calm down and disperse. The mob refused. The magistrate was extremely outnumbered, and it was all he could do, release the prisoners, and of course they escaped. There was missiles, bottles, bricks getting chucked about the place, and as you can see down here, the streets are quite narrow. It must have been absolute chaos. Part of the mob broke off. They had big plans. They were heading to Port Glasgow and they were going to burn it down. Thankfully, the folk in Port Glasgow had already set up a barricade, so that offshoot of the mob did disperse. Greenock medical practitioners listed 6 civilians were dead. 2 more would die of their injuries. The oldest was 65. The youngest chap was an 8-year-old boy. Across central Scotland, 88 men in total were charged with treason. The ringleaders, James Wilson, Andrew Hardy and John Baird, were sentenced to death. Many of those who escaped the death penalty were sent to the penal colonies of New South Wales and Tasmania. Lord Sidmouth had a spy ring operating to pick up any random radicals that might have escaped arrest. So many chaps were forced to flee to Canada and various other colonies on the regular boats that were heading out of Greenock. The effect and ultimately the devastation of the radical war did ensure that uprising and disagreement did not happen for quite some time. It is mentioned in various writings that the pageantry or possibly pomp of Walter Scott and the George IV visit diluted the radical behaviour furthermore. It was also Scott's idea to employ the unemployed weavers in stonemasonry and road building, and they built what is still known as the Radical Road on the Salisbury Plains just opposite Edinburgh Castle. Eventually, the Scottish Reform Act of 1832 would give a Member of Parliament for the first time. 10 years after the event, many of those that had been dumped out in the colonies did get a full pardon. Unfortunately, those who were put to death didn't have the right of pardon. The Radical War is often forgotten in Scottish history, but it truly paved the way to change, and I do feel that that change gives meaning to the souls that lost their lives for this cause.